All right, I'm going to go ahead and admit the folks that are in the room. Hi, everyone. Oops, sorry, Terrance. Hi, everyone.
No, I'm just going to say the good thing about the recording is that you can show it later for folks who were not able to attend.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we can also edit it a little bit. Just welcome to everyone. I'm Jody. I'm the new executive director for the Contra Costa County Bar Association, for those of you whom I have not had the chance to meet. Couple of housekeeping, if you would please, this is a this is not a webinar format, right? This is a Zoom meeting. So if everyone would go ahead and put themselves on mute to reduce the extraneous potential noise, we will get started quite soon. Thank you for joining us. And then please note to everyone, we are recording this session for future use.
And Jody, would you be able to spotlight my window so that folks can see the PowerPoint a little better?
I believe so. Yes.
Ah, perfect. Thank you.
And excellent. We are expecting about 45 people today.
Okay, all, it is 12 o'clock on the nose, and I believe in starting on time. And so people can join us, that's fine, but I want to respect everyone's time. I have been asked to make the introductory remarks. I'm happy to do that. I want to welcome everyone on behalf of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Town Hall Committee, which is a part of the Contra Costa County Bar Association. We frequently come up with various town halls throughout the year, and we all decided that voting rights was an extremely important topic to be talked about, given the historical and continuing erosion of voting rights. Certainly the timing of the upcoming midterm elections. We are actually 41 days away from Election Day. And we also have a trend of apathy in voting. And we all know that there are high stakes involved in our elections. And so we thought this would be an appropriate subject to talk about. We are, the way this is going to work today, we have a very distinguished speaker. We are so honored to have Terrance Evans with us today. He is going to speak for a while. You all have an opportunity to ask questions. And along the way, you can put those questions in the chat, and we'll be busy looking at those and trying to respond to them. Or you can also raise your hand in the Zoom on the bar below. We will take questions and answer those questions at the end of the program. We hope to be finished somewhere between 1 and 1:15. Again, I want to be respectful of your time, but what I really want to do is tell you about Terrance Evans. He is a partner in the San Francisco and Los Angeles offices of Duane Morris, where he serves as the co-leader of the firm's banking and financial services practice. He is also the co-chair of their Diversity and Inclusion Committee. His practice focuses on representing clients in federal and state trial and appellate courts across the United States, including the U.S. Supreme Court. Mr. Evans also regularly counsels clients regarding racial justice and diversity and inclusion issues. He's led dozens of diversity trainings for judges, lawyers, law students, and members of the community around the United States. Mr. Evans is president of the Charles Houston Bar. Thank you. Where did I leave off?
You mentioned president of Charles Houston.
Thank you. He is the president of the Charles Houston Bar Association, the oldest Black bar association in California. He is a co-founder and co-chair of the California Lawyers Association Racial Justice Committee. He's co-chair of the American Bar Association Diversity and Inclusion Committee. He is the first Black man elected to serve as a statewide representative to the board of the California Lawyers Association. He appears frequently on national and local television and radio discussing issues ranging from the United States Supreme Court and California courts to important legislation and civil rights issues. You can find him on YouTube, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. I have had the pleasure of listening to him speak before, and I'm back for a second round because he is so captivating, so inspiring. And so with that, I give you Terrance Evans.
Thank you so much for that amazing introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us for this important discussion. I appreciate it, and I am excited because I've had the opportunity to give similar presentations to other audiences, but I learned a lot in putting this particular presentation together, and I'm excited to share that with you. I'm going to share my screen just so that we can all look at some of the material that we're going to be discussing today. And I just want to make sure before I jump in here, can folks see the screen okay? Okay, perfect. So I've given more than 100 iterations of this presentation to different groups. They've included law schools, colleges, universities. I've spoken with different courts, federal courts. As a matter of fact, tomorrow I'm going to be giving a version of this presentation to the justices of the California Supreme Court and the courts of appeal at the Judicial Council's conference that they're having tomorrow. This map shows a progression that I started to track of bans that have been enacted and introduced throughout the United States and various states to limit access to information similar to what I'll be providing today. And I'd also like to point out that in some of these jurisdictions, as we look at the various maps that I'm going to show you, the conversation that we're having today has been criminalized. So in Kentucky, for example, it is a crime for a teacher to share the information that I'll be sharing with you to any student in grades kindergarten through 12th grade. In many states, teachers can be fired, professors at state universities can be fired. It's pretty chilling to hear the restrictions that are being enacted. But back in May of 2021, we had about 14 states that had banned the kind of discussion that we're going to be having today. I'd also like to point out that in none of these schools were they engaging in critical race theory. We're going to have a discussion like that today. These schools are banning the discussion of history and the contributions of people from underrepresented groups. As of June of 2021, we were up to 21 states that had either banned or introduced legislation banning the kinds of discussions that we're having today. In October 2022 or 2021, I was hosting my 9th annual citywide diversity program. I'm going to be doing my 10th annual on October the 13th, but we're up to 28 states. And today, we're up to about 35 states that have either banned or enacted bans that limit the kind of discussion that we're having today. So by the end of this presentation, I want you to tell me if you think I should be arrested or fired or face some other kind of punishment for sharing this basic history. I think it's important when we talk about voting rights that we understand the historical context. So we're going to briefly look at some of the history that got us to this point. I think it's also important to point out that before anyone else made it to what we now call the United States of America, Native Americans were here. And they were here for approximately 40,000 years. And there were different tribes and there were different phases, but they were here for a very long time. This next map shows you what we currently call the United States of America may have looked like when Native Americans were in control of this part of North America. And as you can see, there were different tribes that covered what we call the United States from coast to coast. And these were tribes that had their own languages and their own cultures. It's estimated that there was anywhere from 140 to 160. They had different languages. Sometimes I think Native Americans get unfairly lumped together as one people, but they were diverse people with diverse cultures. And of course, we understand the story that after the settlers arrived from Europe, there was interaction with the Native Americans. The Native Americans lost, and there was further development and colonization of the United States. One thing I also wanted to point out as we're looking at this history, Christopher Columbus did not discover America. I think most people in California, public schools know and understand that. It's still being taught in much of the rest of the country that he did. He actually never made landfall in what we call the continental United States. As Europeans began to settle and colonize what we call the United States, they needed labor. They needed some folks to help them to work the land, to help them build this country. And so they looked to Africa. There had been some effort to use Native Americans, but many of them were very sensitive to the diseases that came from Europe, and that didn't work out as well. So it was actually King Charles of Spain, who's depicted in this drawing here, who issued a license that authorized the enslavement and the transport of slaves from Africa to help settle the United States. Some historians, they refer to 1619 as being the beginning of slavery in the United States. It was actually 1539. That's when we can trace the very first slave ship. It's possible it could have been sooner, but we can trace it back to at least 1539. And the whole purpose, again, was to bring this labor to help them work the land to establish communities here. When we think about slavery, some folks wonder, how did these folks get here? There was, as some people will say, slavery that existed in Africa, but it was not the plantation slavery that was developed here in the United States and much of the New World. These drawings here show how the slaves were forced from their homeland to the coast where they were to board ships. And this kind of shows what the conditions looked like on some of these slave ships. This diagram here gives you a better idea of how the slaves were transported from Africa to North America. And you can actually see it a little bit in more detail in this next drawing here. They were basically tied together, hundreds of them, and unfortunately living in very difficult conditions, oftentimes living in their own waste, not always having adequate food. If slaves got sick during the voyage, they were just thrown overboard. They were treated as property. And so again, the whole purpose of this was to have the labor that was necessary to work the land to develop this country. So when we think about who built America, America was built on the free labor of Black folks who were brought from Africa. When they arrived here in the United States, they were treated as property. And this is an example of one of the advertisements, just like you will see advertisements for a car or advertisements for a yard sale. The Black folks who were transported here from Africa were treated as property, and they would have sales. They would have advertisements so that people would know where to come and purchase a slave. It forced the separation of mothers from their children, fathers from their children and their wives. They had no right to be together as a family. So it essentially resulted in the destruction of families through this system of slavery that we had here in the United States. In this depiction, we see a mother and her daughter, and oftentimes they were not sold together, they were sold separately. When folks would purchase slaves and they were inspecting slaves, as depicted here in this image, they would want to inspect the property. So it's almost similar to a used car. When you want to get a used car, you typically want to have a mechanic check that car out to make sure it's in good working condition. And so similarly, folks who wanted to buy slaves, they would inspect their property because they were not treated as humans, so that they would see what they were buying and what they were getting. This now kind of fast forwards us to a period in American history where you had folks who started to think more about the importance of having representation. So when we're talking about voting rights, we're talking about accountability and representation. If you vote for your elected representatives, they are accountable to you if they want to stay in office. And so we had reached a point in colonial history where many of the colonists became frustrated that they didn't have adequate representation in the British Parliament. And so this kind of takes us to the the Boston Tea Party that I'm sure many of you heard about in school, where there was frustration about the taxes that were being levied on the colonists, but yet they had no representation of any significance in the British Parliament. And so there was this rebellion. And the rebellion was reflected in the Boston Tea Party. This also led us into the American Revolution, where you had colonists here that were essentially the subjects of Britain, and we're kind of thinking back to the recent passing of Queen Elizabeth. Well, the American colonies were subjects of the British monarchy, of the British government, and there was this frustration that they didn't have adequate representation, and so we had the American Revolution. But as the founding fathers began crafting what the representation of the citizens of what would be the new United States would look like, a lot of it was focused on the males who were putting this together, the men who were putting this together. There was really no consideration about extending any rights to women or people of color, or even white men who did not have property. So when we think about the Declaration of Independence and its significance, and we celebrate the 4th of July and the birth of our country, it's important to understand the context of how we got here. After the Declaration of Independence was adopted, white men with property had the right to vote. But if you were Black, if you were Asian, if you were Hispanic, if you were Native American, if you were of mixed race, if you were a white person who had no property, if you were a woman of any race, if you were Catholic, if you were a Jew, if you were Quaker, if you were Muslim, you could not vote. This was something that was limited to folks who were Protestant white men who had property. It's important also to understand that the words voting, vote, voter, suffrage, none of that appeared anywhere in the Declaration of Independence. And again, it was very male focused. So one of the famous lines from our Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I think in today's society, we would think about rephrasing that to all people are created equally. And also, it goes on to say that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So no contemplation about women in power. It was a very male-focused approach to government. The United States Constitution, of course, adopted in 1788, and in its original form, it gave the power to the states to determine what the standards for voting would be. So there was no federal prescription, if you will, for voting requirements in the original Constitution. All of that was left to the states. And under that system, most of the states only permitted white Protestant males who owned property who were older than 21 to vote. We also got the establishment of the Electoral College. As the Constitution was being debated during the Constitutional Convention, and they were trying to figure out what language would go in there, an issue that came up would be, what do we do with the 4 million or however many million plus slaves that exist mostly in the South? How do we treat these Black folks, and how do we account for them when we're trying to determine representation in the House and the Senate? It's all based on population. And so ironically, it was the northern states that argued that because Black people are treated as property, they should not count as for purposes of determining representation in Congress. And so it was the northern states, which were the abolitionists who were, fighting to end slavery, fighting for opportunities for the Black folks who were enslaved, who came up with the argument that Black people should not count as full people for the purpose of determining representation. So ultimately, the compromise that appears in Article 1, Section 2, and by the way, folks, it's still there. That has not been abolished. There have been efforts to get rid of that provision in the US Constitution. All of those efforts have failed. So you pick up your Article 1, Section 2 of your Constitution, you can Google it, it's still there. And it still suggests that folks who are enslaved, these were the Black folks who were working the plantations, they count as 3 3/5 of a person for the purpose of determining representation in the Congress. And as we'll get a little bit further into discussion, you'll understand that it is the 13th Amendment that ended slavery, that allowed for Black people to count as one whole individual for the purpose of representation in Congress. There have been some recent discussions, Kanye West among them, saying that we should abolish the 13th Amendment. Well, guess what? If we abolish the 13th Amendment, the default is going to be Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, which means that technically Black people would be 3/5 of a person for determining representation. We're now going to take a look at how voting rights developed over time following the adoption of the Constitution. So as of 1830, many states had dropped religion and property ownership requirements for determining who could vote. So basically, voting rights by 1830 had been expanded to include almost all white men. So even if you didn't have property, if you were a white man, you could vote in most of the states by 1830. As of 1868, by that time we had adopted the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment, and it recognized African Americans as citizens, but it only gave Black men the right to vote. So I think there's a misunderstanding sometimes when the 14th Amendment is discussed. Oftentimes people will say that it gave Black people the right to vote. That is not correct. It only gave Black men the right to vote. Black women still did not have the right to vote in this country. And it wasn't just Black men. It was men of other descent also could not vote. So if you were Asian, if you were Hispanic, if you were Native American, as we get further in the discussion, the 14th Amendment did not give them the opportunity to vote. California was among those states that did not consider the 14th Amendment as extending to anyone else other than Black men. The 15th Amendment recognized that freed slaves and other African Americans, again, we're only talking about men, had the right to vote. It prohibited state and local governments from denying them the ability to vote. And again, just to clarify here, 14th Amendment, it conferred citizenship. 15th Amendment, the right to vote limited to men. As we get a little bit further along, I think it's important to point out that we also had the rise of the Ku Klux Klan during this period of time of enfranchisement of Black men and the citizenship being extended to Black people in this country. You had the rise of the KKK, which essentially pushed back on this notion that non-whites could, of course, a lot of terror that was taking place that we'll discuss a little bit more as we get into the presentation. There was, of course, the suffrage movement that was taking place along the same time that we had the fight for citizenship and civil rights for Black people. And the suffrage movement was largely focused on extending the right to vote to white women. There were a number of Black women who participated in the suffrage movement as well, but some of the concern was that if we include Black women and other women of color in this discussion about extending the right to vote to women, that it would make it more difficult. So women of color, Black women in particular, were kind of pushed aside to clear the way for white women to have the opportunity to get suffrage. And of course, when the 19th Amendment was passed, it gave white women the right to vote. And many times in our discussions of history, we will say that women got the right to vote, but it was only white women. If you were Black, if you were Hispanic, if you were Native American, if you were Asian, you did not get the right to vote when the 19th Amendment was passed. In 1924, we had the Indian Citizenship Act, and it declared all non-citizen Native Americans born within the United States to be citizens. In 1940, Congress recognizes Native Americans as citizens. We see President Coolidge here depicted in the picture with a group of Native Americans. And it was not until 1947 that Native Americans were given the right to vote. We, of course, had in 1943, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 repealed, and it gave Chinese and Asian folks the right to vote in much of the United States. And that included California, and we'll get into that discussion a bit later. 1964, Congress ratifies the 24th Amendment. It outlawed poll taxes. In this picture here, we see a gentleman collecting poll taxes. There was an effort to make it as difficult as possible for Black folks and other people of color to vote in this country. And so there were poll taxes. Essentially, you had to pay to vote. Voting was not free. And I think many of us take for granted that when it's time to cast your ballot, you go to your polling place, you vote, you leave, you do what you have to do. Back in the pre-1964 era, there were taxes that people had to pay, and if they couldn't afford to pay them, they did not vote. There were also systems set up in much of the South where they would have a jar with jelly beans, and you would have to correctly guess the number of jelly beans in the jar, and if you were incorrect, you couldn't vote. So there were all kinds of barriers that were put up to voting. But in 1964, the 24th Amendment outlawed those poll taxes. 2 years later, the US Supreme Court expanded that understanding. It's important also to understand that people gave their lives so that folks could vote. When we talk about voting and what it took to get to the Voting Rights Act and the opportunity for folks to be active participants in the democracy so that they could hold elected officials accountable, people literally put their lives on the line. So these pictures here show you the confrontation that took place on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and it shows right before and right after this interaction with the police. You had marchers. They were all different races, Black, white, Asian, everybody came together, and they were marching on this famous bridge in Selma, Alabama. John Lewis, who passed away a couple of years ago, is depicted in the light colored trench coat that you see there on the right. And then when they would not leave, and all they wanted to do was the opportunity to vote. They just wanted the opportunity to vote and be active participants in democracy. When they would not leave, they were viciously beaten by the police. And you see over on the right, you see Congressman John Lewis. He was viciously beaten and his skull was fractured. You see another woman here who was also viciously beaten. There was no lesser punishment for women who were fighting for the opportunity to vote. You see white people here who were also fighting to create the opportunity for African Americans to vote. They were also beaten. I think it's also important to take a moment to understand that people gave their lives so that people could vote in this country, so that people could go to school in this country, so that people would have the right to go to college, the right to read, just basic civil rights, the right to be able to go to a restaurant or a hotel, things that we take for granted. And as I tried to figure out how I could best convey that people gave their lives, I thought the best way to do it would be to show you pictures of people who actually died so that people who look like me, people who look like other people of color could vote. So we have here May 7th, 1955. In Mississippi, you had the Reverend George Lee. He was one of the first Black people registered to vote in his county. It upset a number of white officials, and he was murdered because he was trying to register Black people to vote. So that gentleman you see in the top picture, he was murdered for trying to register people to vote. The next gentleman that we have here is Lamar Smith. And August 13th, 1955, he was shot dead on the courthouse lawn. And again, he was trying to create opportunities for Black people to vote. We have Emmett Till, and this is not directly connected to voting, but it happened around the same time where you had this 14-year-old boy who was brutally beaten. His skull was crushed because he was accused to have whistled at a young white girl. That young white girl grew up, became a woman, and admitted that she lied about him whistling at her. But even if he had whistled at her, you just think about the brutality of having your skull smashed in. We had another gentleman, John Earl Reese, couldn't find a picture, only 16 years old, but he was also killed as part of this effort to terrorize people who were fighting for civil rights and the right to vote. We have Willie Everts Jr. here. He was believed to have been dating a white woman, so he was murdered. He was brutally murdered. You had this other gentleman here. His name was Mark Parker. He hadn't done anything wrong, but he was accused of raping a white woman. He actually was trying to get people to register to vote. He was brutally murdered. And it's also important to keep in context here that this was during a period of time, and we'll get further into this discussion, where people of color, Black people, could not testify against white people, couldn't be witnesses against anyone. There was no prosecution, so people could make up anything about you, and that could be justified for killing you. This was a gentleman here. His name is Herbert Lee. He was registering Black people to vote. It made people very upset. They didn't like the idea that Black people were being registered. They didn't want Black people to vote, so they murdered him. You had this gentleman that we see here, Corporal Roman Ducksworth Jr. He was actually a military officer. He was on leave to visit his sick wife. He was on a bus. People didn't like that they had a Black person on the bus. During this period of time, Black people had no right to use public transportation. He was ordered off the bus, and he was murdered because people thought he was a freedom rider. Freedom riders were people who traveled throughout the South registering people to vote. He wasn't doing that. He was a military guy who just wanted to go see his sick wife, and he was murdered because people thought he was registering people to vote. There were a lot of white people who gave their lives to create opportunities for Black people and other people of color to vote. We have Paul Guihart. He was a reporter for the French news service here, and he was murdered by people who thought that he was part of some effort to get folks registered, and he actually wasn't. He was just a reporter. You had a white postal worker here. We have William Lewis Moore. He had planned to deliver a governor to the, he had planned to deliver a letter to the governor of Mississippi, trying to urge him to create opportunities for Black people to vote and Black people to go to school and Black people to go to restaurants. He just wanted all of the discrimination and racism to stop. And just because he mentioned that he wanted to send a letter to the governor, he was murdered. You had Medgar Evers, who was a civil rights leader. He was murdered for registering people to vote in Jackson, Mississippi. He was murdered by a sniper in front of his family in his front yard as he got out of his car. You had these 4 young Black girls, Adie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, Cynthia Wesley. They were murdered because their families were involved in the effort to create opportunities for people to vote and people to go to school. You had Virgil Lamar Ware, 13 years old. He was murdered by a group of segregationists who did not like the efforts that were being made by members of his family to create opportunities for people to vote, for people to be able to go to public accommodations and restaurants and schools. Didn't like it. They murdered him. You had a gentleman here, Lewis Allen, who witnessed the murder of a civil rights worker. And he hadn't done anything else other than witness the murder. He had been threatened numerous times that if he gave any testimony about this murder that he witnessed of a civil rights worker, that he would be killed. He was actually trying to flee, and he did not get very far, and he was murdered for witnessing civil rights murder. We had the Reverend Bruce Clunder. He was among civil rights workers. He was trying to help with efforts for voting and desegregating public schools. He was murdered for being part of this effort to create opportunities to vote. You had these young men who were depicted here. They were part of this effort to help African Americans fight against oppression and discrimination. They were murdered. You had these 3 young men, 2 white men and a Black man in Philadelphia, Mississippi. They were registering people to vote throughout the South. They were trying to create opportunities so that everyone could have their voice heard. All 3 of them were murdered. They were shot in the head brutally beaten for trying to help people to vote. You had here the Lieutenant Colonel Lamel Penn of Washington, D.C. He was an educator. He was shot and killed by a Klansman simply for being Black. He hadn't done anything. Going back to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, we were talking about how Congressman Lewis was brutally beaten simply for trying to create opportunities for people to vote. This young man here, a college graduate, he was there. He was part of this effort to just march peacefully so that people could raise awareness about the need to be able to vote and participate in American society. He was murdered because he just wanted to vote. You had the Reverend James Reed. He was a minister, and he had organized a number of white clergymen to help support marchers who were fighting for the right to vote, and he was murdered. You had this young woman here, Viola Gregg Liuzzo. She was just a housewife, and she was trying to help marchers get from Selma to Montgomery. All she was doing was trying to help transfer people who were fighting for the right to vote. This young woman that we see here was murdered for trying to help people fight for the right to vote. You had this young man here who was a police officer, and he was just part of the police force. They were giving opportunities to Black folks to join the police force after demands from civil rights workers, and he was murdered because people assumed that he must have had something to do with fighting for the right to vote. We have Willie Brewster, we have Jonathan McDaniels, we have Samuel Young, we have Vernon Dahmer, we have the Reverend Chester White, we have Clarence Triggs, we have Wallace Jackson, we have Benjamin Brown, we have Samuel Ephesians Hammond Jr., Delano Herman Middleton, Henry Ezekiel Smith, and of course, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. We could go through hundreds of people. If you go to the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Tennessee, they actually have a wall of people who gave their lives for the right to vote. And when I saw it, I was just there 2 months ago for the National Bar Association convention. I actually got emotional because you see that hundreds of people, Black people, white people, Asian people, Hispanic people, died just because they wanted the right to vote. After all of that, we have the Civil Rights Act that gets passed of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that passes, that bans literacy tests and removes many obstacles to the right to vote. We also have 18-year-olds who get the right to vote in 1971, and we have voting rights that are continually expanded to different groups. Included amongst those who are fighting for the right to vote are disabled people. And so we have in 1982, the Voting Rights Act is amended to extend guarantees to Americans with disabilities. You would have voting locations that were inaccessible to people with wheelchairs and other disabilities. This expansion in 1982 was designed to address that issue. In 1990, Congress officially passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, and there were continued efforts to expand opportunities for people to vote. I'm going to move on to a couple of other things that I think are really important. The Voting Rights Act in June of 2013 was substantially rolled back by the US Supreme Court in a 5-4 vote. So you had states, and you can see them reflected here on this map, that historically had created barriers to voting and opportunities for people to vote in much of the South. And they had to get pre-clearance from the Department of Justice before enacting any type of law that could make it more difficult to vote. Well, in Shelby County versus Holder, the Supreme Court rolled back the pre-clearance requirement and basically said, you know what, we've made great progress. We don't see that there's a problem. We're past racism and all this. We're going to be fine. And I thought that there was a wonderful quote in RBG's dissent where she says, just because you're in the middle of a rainstorm, and I'm paraphrasing, you don't get rid of your umbrella. Immediately after the court got rid of the pre-clearance requirement, the states that you see reflected here enacted barriers similar to those that predated the Voting Rights Act to make it more challenging for folks to vote. If we fast forward to 2020, following the election of President Biden, there have been efforts by numerous states, and you see them reflected here on the chart, and I've included the links, to enact barriers that are reminiscent of the barriers that existed before the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1965. Many of the same barriers to people with disabilities, people who are from underrepresented groups have been enacted. I want to get to a few other details, and then we'll come back to our voting rights discussion, just to create some additional context as people start thinking about these issues related to race. So modern day policing that we have today, it started in this country as slave patrols. So the very first police forces that we had in the United States, they were slave patrols that were put in place to capture slaves that escaped, return slaves to formerly enslaved people to their slave owners when they got to free territory. And I have in the written materials an example of the oath that a number of these officers took. They were also put in place to enforce Jim Crow laws, which included barriers to voting. So for example, there were laws in place after the end of slavery, following Reconstruction, that prohibited Black people from owning property or guns, prohibited Black people, and actually all people of color from voting, and also had limitations on the types of work that folks could engage in. These are other laws that police enforce. And I think this is important too, because we're thinking about the interaction between law enforcement and people of color. These Black codes prohibited marriages between whites and freed Blacks, mandated segregation of cemeteries, schools, transportation, mandated segregation and requirements on people of 18 years old and above, made it illegal for Black people to read or write. So this was after slavery. You had many states that made it illegal for Black people and other people of color to learn how to read or write, prohibit them from owning property, other things like that. So as we move to the present, there has always been this difficult interaction between communities of color and the police, starting back with slavery, starting with the enforcement of Jim Crow laws that has created this tension between these communities. And a lot of that continued to the present. There are a couple of other things that I also wanted to get to, and I wanted to specifically talk about California, because when we talk about voting restrictions, when we talk about limitations on the ability for people of color to participate fully in the government, we often think a lot about the South, but it's important to understand that California has its own racist past. And when California was founded, it was founded with this desire to keep people of color out. The very first governor of California was Peter H. Burnett. He was born and raised in Tennessee, and he made it his mission to keep African Americans out, to get out Native Americans, to keep out Asian and Hispanic folks. And he was responsible for a lot of the Jim Crow laws that were in effect in California. And as a matter of fact, there were more Jim Crow laws in California than in many other parts of the South. So in California, there were laws that barred non-whites from testifying in any case where a white person was a party. So when we talk about some of these Black people who found themselves in these uncomfortable situations with the law, they could not testify against whites. It didn't matter if it was an accident case, you couldn't testify. It didn't matter if you witnessed a murder, you couldn't testify. No one who was not white could testify. And we'll get into that a little bit more. Barred non-whites from serving on a jury, barred non-whites from voting. This happened in California, so this wasn't just a Southern problem. Barred non-whites from holding elective office. We think now that we've had many people of different backgrounds serving in different capacities, but that was illegal here in California for about 100 years. Barred non-whites from serving as judges, barred non-white attorneys from questioning white witnesses. And this is something that many people did not know or did not understand. But for about 100 years in California, if you look like me and you asked a white witness a question, whether it was in a courtroom or a deposition, they did not have to answer you. Barred non-whites from public schools, barred non-whites from buying and renting property. This kind gets into the issue of redlining. People wonder, why do we have Black neighborhoods and Hispanic neighborhoods and Asian neighborhoods? It's because there were specific zones within cities that were designated for people of color and for white people. And that carries over to the day with, a lot of these communities still existing. We already talked about barred non-whites from being buried in certain cemeteries. This is another one that I think people don't fully appreciate. My parents grew up during the Jim Crow era, and they tell me the stories about being barred from restaurants, barred from hotels, barred from movie theaters, barred from swimming pools. If you were Black, you could not use public swimming pools in California. If you were Black, you could not use public beaches in California. These were limited to white people for about 100 years, barred non-whites from admission to bar associations. I also want to just highlight the hospital issue. If you were not white in California and you got sick, you were in an accident, you needed immediate medical attention, you could not go to any hospital. And this was true for much of the United States. You could only go to a hospital that treated people of color. You could not go anywhere. And if you couldn't get there in time, you would die. My mother and all of her siblings were born at home because they did not live near a hospital that treated Black people. Barred non-whites from admissions to bar associations. So you wonder why you have Black bar associations and Hispanic bar associations and Native American and all these other ethnic bar associations. I'm currently president of Charles Houston, a Black bar association. It's because that when these organizations were founded, people of color could not be part of the state bar or the American Bar Association. Barred non-whites from public transportation, barred non-whites from equal pay for equal work. When we talk about equal pay for equal work, we're often thinking about it in the context of women and women not earning what men earn for the same job. Well, the same was true for over 100 years, well over 100 years in California and much of the rest of the United States. And as a matter of fact, when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, in order to get the votes they needed to get it through Congress, big labor mandated that there would not be any equal pay for equal work or equal seniority for non-whites with whites. So even after the Civil Rights Act was passed, you still did not earn seniority at the same rate. So for example, if you have a Black person who works for 20 years on a job, they may get credit for 5 years for purposes of seniority, but the white person would get credit for all 20 years. So therefore, they would never be able to catch up. I want to cover two cases, really important cases in California history. The first is People versus Hall. And this was a case where you had a white man who was convicted of murdering an Asian man. There were numerous Asian witnesses who witnessed this murder. They raised their hand, they testified, they said, we saw him murder our friend. There's no doubt about it. The white man was sentenced to death. But his attorney appealed, went all the way to the California Supreme Court, and they appealed based on this statute that existed at the time. It was Section 394 of the California Civil Practice Act, and it provided no Indian or Negro shall be allowed to testify as a witness in any action where a white person is a party. And the attorney said, hey, wait a minute. My client is, my client was testified against by an Asian person. And even though the statute doesn't mention Asian, we believe the term Negro should be a catch-all for anybody who isn't white. So the California Supreme Court struggled with this. The Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court at the time, his name was Hugh C. Murray, the youngest California Supreme Court justice ever. He's depicted here, 27 years old. He came up with the idea that yes, the term Negro is a catch-all phrase for anybody who isn't white. And so therefore, it doesn't matter that the statute doesn't mention Asian. Anyone who is not white cannot testify in any case where a white person is a party. Therefore, all of these witnesses who witnessed the murder are deemed incompetent, and the white man who had been sentenced to death for the murder goes free. The people in the Asian community in California at the time were outraged. They're like, what the heck are you talking about? We witnessed this murder. You can't have this type of policy. That means that anybody who's white can kill anybody who's Asian and get away with it. They already could kill anybody who was Black or Hispanic or Native American. We can't have this type of policy. We can't have people with a license essentially to kill. And so they appealed to the governor at the time, John Bigler. he actually liked the decision by the California Supreme Court. And in his reelection campaign, he campaigned on an anti-Asian platform. They appealed to members of the California legislature, said there's no way you can just allow people of color to be murdered and there's no accountability. Well, the California legislature responded. And not only did they not have any sympathy for the Asian community, they codified the Hall decision into law. And they said it also applies to civil cases. So that means that in any civil case, you have no ability to testify against a white person. So if that person goes and rams your car, breaks into your house, tells you to get out of your house, I'm taking your house, I'm taking your business, I'm taking everything you own, there was no way to fight back. And that happened all throughout California. People versus Alea was another important case. This case dealt with whether or not a person who looks white but has dark features, if they can testify in a case, are they deemed competent? And in this case, you had a white criminal defendant. He was convicted of first-degree murder. A Turkish man who had Caucasian features but dark skin witnessed the murder. And so the issue for the California Supreme Court is what makes somebody incompetent to testify? Is it the color of their skin or the features or a combination? So to make a long story short, the California Supreme Court said that if you have Caucasian features and dark skin, say you go out and get a nice suntan, you don't lose your white privilege. But if you have African features and you happen to be light-skinned, you don't get white privilege. So in this case, the Turkish man was deemed to be sufficiently white because he had Caucasian features. There were incremental efforts after those cases to repeal some of those injustices, but it took over 100 years to do that in California. I'll cover a couple of other issues and then we'll create some opportunity for questions. And I know it's a lot of material that we're going through fast, and I do encourage people to look at the written materials. So the question here is, what are reparations? We briefly talked about slavery. We briefly talked about the disenfranchisement of Black people and other people of color. But what are reparations? And it's essentially a system to redress the past wrongs. You had Black people who worked for 300 plus years as slaves for generations, not getting any compensation for that. And then after that, for another 100 years, working as slave croppers, sharecroppers, which essentially was another form of slavery. So 400 years, but they never received any reparations. Reparations have gone to Native Americans. Obviously, it didn't completely make them whole, but we're familiar with reservations. Reparations went to Japanese who were forced to live in internment camps. Also, reparations went to some Jews. But Black folks are the only group that never got any reparations. However, it was contemplated. So we go back to President Abraham Lincoln, and he is not only was active in trying to end slavery for the benefit of preserving the Union, not necessarily because he didn't agree with the institution of slavery. He was trying to find a way to preserve the Union. And he had this idea, and he discussed it with leaders from the Black community to provide former Black slaves with 40 acres and a mule. So you imagine you worked hundreds of years, you have nothing to show for it, you have no place to go, you have nothing. But to help Black folks get on their feet, Abraham Lincoln was behind this plan to provide Black families with 40 acres and a mule to kind of get them started. Unfortunately, when he was assassinated, this plan died with him. So the Black community suffered substantially when Abraham Lincoln died because his plan to give them reparations died with him. His vice president, who was a Southerner, Andrew Johnson, canceled that completely. And not only did he not give anything to help the Black families get on the feet, he did the opposite. He helped a lot of the slave owners get reparations because he said that they had lost their property. A lot of Black families, as I mentioned, following slavery were forced to work as sharecroppers. My grandparents also were forced to work as sharecroppers. A couple of other facts that I just want people to be aware of, that's the Homestead Act. It was the greatest generator of wealth in American history. Basically, hundreds of millions of acres were given by the federal government to people so they could start their lives and they could develop the middle part of the country. 99% of the benefits of that went to white families, and many of them were immigrants from Europe who moved here specifically to take advantage of that program. Black people were specifically excluded, as were every other race of people. 270 million acres were given out, and folks were just completely kept out of that who were not white. The New Deal. Many people think about FDR and the New Deal and all of these amazing social programs. What people are often not aware of is that Black people and other people of color were specifically excluded from the benefits. You had about 1.2 million Black people who served in World War II, fighting bravely for this country. But when they came back to take advantage of some of the social programs that FDR created, they were excluded. And it was done this way in the way that the programs were administered. So the GI Bill, it provided the former soldiers to have the opportunity to have money to go to college for themselves and their children. It provided them with money for down payment so that they could buy a house. It provided them with money so that they could start a business. It also gave them money for living expenses while they were in college so that they would be able to take care of themselves and feed their families while they got an education. That was denied to the 1.2 million Black veterans. So you just imagine when we think about the disparities between Black people and white people, people of color and white people, just think about if those 1.2 million former soldiers who had given their lives on the line for this country in World War II, if all 1.2 million of them had been given money to go to college, if all 1.2 million of them have been given money so that their children could go to college, if all 1.2 million of them have been given money to buy a house or to start a business and money for living expenses while they studied in college, imagine how different their life experience might have been. The denial of social programs also included Social Security, which was denied to about 70% of Black people. Another thing that I'll cover very briefly that resulted in a number of disparities that we see between communities of color and other communities are the massacres. And some of them they've made movies of. We've talked about Tulsa, we've talked about Rosewood, but based on my research, there's at least 31 different massacres of Black communities where everything was taken. So for example, you had Black communities that formed in spite of Jim Crow, in spite of all of the racism, and they had their own hospitals, they had their own schools, they had their own churches, they had their own businesses, they had their own everything. And then you had folks that came in and burned these down to the ground. And to add insult to injury, the Black people did not get to keep the property after it was burned down. They lost everything. They lost the structures on the property, and they couldn't call the police, they couldn't go to court, they couldn't do anything. All of this was taken away. So you had Tulsa, you had Chicago, you had Springfield, you had East St. Louis, Vicksburg, Slocum, Colfax, Opelousas, Thibodaux, Memphis, Elaine, Clinton, Rosewood, St. Bernard Parish, New Orleans, Detroit, Washington, Wilmington, Atlanta, New York, Ufalufa, Camilla, Osi. These were all entire Black communities, entire Black neighborhoods, and all of them were completely burned to the ground. And the Black people got nothing. So all of that generational wealth that could have been shared and passed down, it was all taken from them. A quick thing about California, about 100 years before there was a Rosa Parks, there was a Charlotte L. Brown. She was involved in desegregating public transportation in San Francisco. I have that information in the written materials. I encourage you to see it. And then I'll just quickly hit on the Chavez ravine. And so I'm a Giants fan, even though I'm originally from LA, and people say, well, why are you a Giants fan? You're from LA. Well, my family has not been fans of the Dodgers for a long time, and it has nothing to do with athleticism. My forefathers had property that was in Chavez ravine, which was mostly a Hispanic neighborhood. And to make a long story short, when they went to build Dodger Stadium, they needed a place to build it. So you had the owners of the Dodgers who partnered with the city officials, and they essentially said, hey, where can we use eminent domain to take property to build our stadium? They decided to go after the poorest neighborhood in Los Angeles, which was Chavez Ravine, and they offered people basically crumbs for homes that they owned. And many of the people said, there's no way in the world that I'm taking that. I am not taking that. I want fair market value. of course, this was during a time where people of color could not sue white people or testify against white people. There were lawyers who went to try to come to the rescue and fight, but it didn't work. And so these people were dragged out of their house, and you see pictures here, people dragged out of their homes, forced out of their property. That's a picture of what Chavez Ravine looked like before, but literally carried by force out of their homes. This is a veteran of World War II. He had given his life. He had been shot multiple times, but kept fighting for this country. He refused to sell his house for pennies for the construction of Dodger Stadium. They bulldozed it. And he said, "Is this what I fought for? I put my life on the line for this amazing country, and this is how I'm treated. They bulldozed my house. He never got a penny for it." These are other homes that were completely demolished, and the people never got paid. They never got reparations, never. So my forefathers, who also had property in this area, they lost their homes for the construction of Dodger Stadium. And to this day, our family has never gotten a penny. So now we have beautiful Dodger Stadium, and that is the result. There's a lot of amazing information in here, and I want to make sure that folks have an opportunity to have questions, but we're just about done here. You know, this issue with systemic oppression and racism, it's not something that has been something that I could escape. Even though I'm a partner at a big law firm and I'm president of the Bar Association, I've had a number of experiences, and I'll tell them very, very quickly. I had a near-death experience in a coffee shop in Los Angeles while studying for a criminal law exam, minding my own business, my laptop, my books. 4 officers come into the coffee shop. Before I know it, I'm surrounded by 12 officers. At least 4 of them have guns pointed to my head. And they say I fit the description of somebody who robbed a store. I said, "Hey, I'm just a law student minding my own business." And it was one of the most horrific moments of my life, because I knew that if I made any sudden movement, I would be dead, as have been many Black people who've had interactions with the police. It was just really traumatic. I had an experience at Sonoma County Superior Court where I was there to argue a dispositive motion in a high-profile case. The sheriff's deputy, as I went through security, said he didn't believe I was a real lawyer. He thought I was causing problems. I was detained because he didn't believe I was a real lawyer and ended up missing my oral argument. Thankfully, we still won on the pleadings. You know, and I've had numerous experiences with bias, as has any person of color, as has any Black person. And so your education doesn't insulate you. I get stopped regularly for driving a nice car because people can't believe that someone who looks like me can afford to drive a nice car. So it's this constant effort of trying to, you know, prove yourself all the time, where it just never quite makes it. I want to make sure that we get a chance to get into some of the questions, because I know there's a lot of material here. I'm just checking to see if there are any questions here. So I think it's important, as we look at voting rights, as we look at the effort to disenfranchise people, that we understand historically what has happened. There is a case that I just wanted to make sure that we get to, and I'm going to fast forward to that case. It's currently pending before the Supreme Court. It is Moore versus Harper, and I think this is one of the most important civil rights cases of our time, certainly of recent times. It's pending right now before the U.S. Supreme Court, and it involves the North Carolina legislature and this theory of the independent state legislature. And a lot of this came out of the 2020 election. But the bottom line of this case is that if a state legislature does not agree with the popular vote of their state, they will be able to nullify the popular vote and replace whoever they want to be the recipient of their electoral vote. So for example, if it's a Democrat or a Republican or independent that gets the majority of the popular vote in their state, they will be able to give those votes to whomever they want. And if the Supreme Court sides with the folks who are putting forth this independent state legislature theory, it would make voting meaningless, because it wouldn't matter if you got the most votes. You would still not necessarily win because of the ability of the state legislature to nullify the vote. So there's a lot that we need to be thinking of. The decision in that case will likely come down in October. And I want folks to be mindful of that. I'm going to stop the share and I'm going to take another look at the chat just to make sure that we cover everything. Okay, let's see here. Actually, the woman did admit that it was false. So there was a recent, and this goes to Emmett Till. I'm gonna just read it here. Correction, it was an adult married white woman, and she never admitted it was false. She also said he grabbed her. That was false. She still lives to this day and has a pending warrant. There was actually a recent admission that I read about in the news where she admitted that she had not told the truth. So that's something that I saw recently. At the time, she didn't, and for many decades, but there was a recent admission that I saw that it was. But I mean, I guess the larger point is that there were so many people who really put their lives on the line so that we could have basic civil rights that many of us take for granted. Just the right to go to school, the right to vote, the right to have public accommodations. And those are things that we need to really be thankful that we have and not lose sight of that. Are there any questions? I want to make sure that there's time for questions. I know I kind of raced through different parts of the presentation, but I want to make sure that folks who may have questions have an opportunity to ask any questions. And it's kind of hard for me to see the hands, so yeah. If we don't have any questions, I don't know if Jody or Heidi, if you had any final thoughts. I want to make sure that I give you the opportunity.
Folks could also raise their hand. That'll move them up to the top of the board. Terrance, do you want me to take you off spotlight to give you a better view?
Sure, that's fine.
Okay. There we
Right,
go.
and Terrance, we're all helping you identify if there are hands up. So there is one up now from Jonathan. Hi, Jonathan.
Hi.
Hey,
good
Jonathan.
afternoon. Hey, and thank you so much for being here and for presenting that material. It was very informative. It was great. I just wanted to, as a fellow alum of the same firm, although I go way back before your time, my question to you was just, could you speak a little bit about how you have navigated the world of big law? You mentioned some of the experiences. You had a slide there with some experiences, but I'm referring to inside the walls of the law firm. How has that been for you? Do you have any words of wisdom to impart?
No, I appreciate it. So I think there have been a couple of things that have been important to me in my journey of trying to navigate big law. I've been able to connect with other African Americans who have been on this journey, and that's been helpful to hear their experiences. But I've also learned the importance of not taking anything for granted and understanding that you're not going to get the benefit of the doubt. And so what I mean by that, and I tell this to a lot of young people of color who are entering the legal profession, and it actually gets to something that I didn't share, and I'll just share this briefly because I think it kind of explains it. It goes to this Nexon's story. And so basically, there was and I'm just going to fast forward because I think it helps to illustrate the point. There was a famous study. It's called Written in White and Black. It's also in the written materials that I provided, where you had 60 law firm partners that were provided with an identical memo. Half of them were told that it's written by a Black young associate. The other half are told that it's written by a white young associate. And they're asked to evaluate it. The memos are identical. And what they found is that when people thought that they were looking at a memo that was written by an African American, they tended to be much more critical. You had comments where people said, hey, does this person belong here? Did they get here on affirmative action? Do they really have the skills here? And when they thought they were looking at a memo that was written by a white associate, they tended to be a lot kinder. They looked over mistakes and said, you know what, this associate was probably tired. They're working so hard for the firm that they made these mistakes. And so what I figured out early on in my career is that you really don't get that type of latitude when you're a person of color. You have to always be, and nobody's perfect, obviously, but you have to always be as close to perfect as possible. You also have to really understand the majority culture and the norms in order to survive. And I've learned that the opposite is not true. So for example, for Black people and other people of color to make it, you have to understand how the majority of the white community in the professional space interact and what their expectations are and what the cultural norms are in order to survive, in order to be accepted. The opposite is not true. So all of that has been helpful. I've had great mentors who have been very supportive. And then also I had this sense that I didn't have the luxury of failing. I come from a working class background. My father was a janitor. My mother was a cook. I had to do whatever I could to make it, not only for myself, but for my family. And the fear of failure also was helpful to me. I see that Heidi's hand is also up.
I just want to say that I don't think you should be arrested for this presentation. I am very glad to have been part of it, to listen to what you did. The deep dive and the amount of work that you put into the research is amazing. It shows. I can't wait to look at the materials that are going to be provided more closely. But I did mention in the beginning that we're 41 days out from Election Day. For folks here who want to help out and make sure that we continue to have the right to vote, what can we do?
Well, I think, first of all, we don't want to take it for granted, right? So I know that there are polls out there that say that one side is potentially doing better and things are shifting. You don't want to take anything for granted. Every single vote matters. And to the extent that you feel comfortable in California that things are going the right way, I think it's important for us to reach out to some of those battleground states where they have all of these very restrictive laws that are going to make it that much more challenging to vote. So if it's important to you that we have a Senate that is reflective of the values that are important to all of us, I would say in Georgia and a number of these other places, we can volunteer our time. So I know that the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, they have phone banks where you can, from the comfort of your home in California, answer questions from voters about how to vote and what their rights are, and they give you a script and they give you all that information. I know Stacey Abrams also has an organization that she's created that you can volunteer from the comfort of your home. And I think all of that helps to the extent that you can financially make any contribution of any size to some of these candidates that are going to be essential to having control of the Senate or the House. Yeah, please consider that. And I think all of it matters. And also encourage anybody that you know who lives in those states to get involved and give their time and let them know that it's going to make a difference. Any other questions that we have? Well, I want to thank everybody for the opportunity to make this presentation. And I will check out the documentary that was referenced in the comments about whether or not that was an admission made by Emmett Till's accuser or not. But I think the larger point is there have been tremendous sacrifices for all of us to have the right to vote, to have access to everything that we enjoy and take for granted. And we need to be careful that it doesn't get rolled back, because there's certainly an effort to limit the kind of information that was shared during this presentation. Again, if I were in Kentucky and I had given this presentation to a high school class or middle school class, I would have committed a criminal offense and could be arrested. And many other parts of the country, as demonstrated on that map, this information that I shared could get me fired. But thankfully, we live in California where we have the freedom to express ourselves. And if we want to preserve this freedom, we have to vote. And we have to make sure that other people have the opportunity to vote. So that way they can hold people accountable and protect our democracy. So thank you so very much. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I'm so grateful for this wonderful conversation. Any other questions before we wrap up? I know we've got a 1:15 target time. Well, I would encourage.
I was going to say people will probably have so much information going through their heads. I know I could listen to you all day, as I believe others on this call would agree with me. So I just think it's so much information at one point in terms of the questions. Were you going to say something else, Terrance?
Yeah, I was just going to say there is a program that's happening tomorrow evening for those of you in the Bay Area at Varela. It's a free diversity program where I'll be speaking with leaders from other firms on D&I on October the 13th. I'll be hosting the 10th annual citywide diversity program for Bar Association of San Francisco. It's free. And I'll be speaking with the leaders from all of the diverse bars, the largest ones in Northern California. And then lastly, I encourage folks to come out on December 3rd, where we're going to be honoring judges and civil rights leaders at the Charles Houston Bar Association Gala in San Francisco. So all of this information is on our website. And thanks again. I appreciate the opportunity.
Great. And thank you, Terrance. Please, everyone help me. Thanks, Heidi, for giving you a round of applause. I just think you're I know a lot went into preparing this, and just the history and putting it all together created a very rich, informative, and passionate presentation that we all very much appreciated. So thanks to all of the Town Hall Committee members for supporting this and helping to organize this presentation. I will put out a plug for anyone out there who would like to join the Contra Costa County DEI Town Hall Committee to please let us know, let me know, or let Jody know, or put it in the chat. And finally, if anyone out there has ideas that you would like to hear for an upcoming town hall, please include those suggested topic areas, and that can be looked at and considered by the committee. So with that, I will let everybody get back to their day. We are ending right on time. And again, special thanks to Terrance. Much gratitude.
Thank you. Thank you very much.